When I was a junior youth, so probably around starting 11 and going into high school, which is, in my teens, I did have a kind of this energy of anger that I had developed because I saw these injustices specifically towards my family. So it was very personal. And I didn't understand what to do or how to deal with it. I think the only way I knew how to channel it was to actually learn about, what kind of injustices existed in the world and really educate myself and learn to find positive ways to protest. So I just remember reading and hearing stories about Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I was really inspired by what they did in terms of nonviolence. So nonviolence in response to violence was really something that I was attracted to. I became sort of strangely interested in stories about violence within the home environment. I didn't experience it within my own home in terms of my parents, but I always somehow knew that there was a connection between the violence that I saw out in the world and violence that people experience at home. So at a very young age, I became really interested in personal stories about domestic violence. And back then, which was around the 1970s, early 80s, I think that was a time that the domestic violence movement, the women's movement, became much more in the forefront of people's awareness. And interestingly enough, the domestic violence movement actually began. It was born in Minnesota, in Duluth. But that anger that I had sort of building up in me, it just became more fueled the more I learned about what people were doing to harm other people, just simply because of who they were, being born, who they were from different backgrounds. Growing up, my parents were very open. Even though I had a lot of my cousins and family members around that were of Chinese background, we always had kids of other nationalities and backgrounds around us. There were white kids that were with us. There were African-American kids that were playing with us. And so we had a lot of people of different backgrounds with us. I don't even think that my mom and dad were necessarily consciously thinking like, oh, we want to promote the oneness of humanity in our household. Somehow it's just through natural connections and relationships that my parents had with our neighbors and coworkers that we just spent time together. And it's so interesting that I hadn't ever really thought about it until now that became sort of the model for me in terms of how you connect with other human beings and how you break down barriers is actually through authentic, real relationships. When I first heard about Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith, all the teachings, it sort of just all made sense to me. So in many ways, it was a logical process for me, just paying attention to some of the teachings. I was really attracted to Baha'u'llah's teachings on the equality of women and men. And I guess in that sense, it did make sense. There was a direct connection between my sort of personal interest, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but I had sort of a question about, well, if there's so much violence in a home, how do you end it? And so I think when I read things about what Baha'u'llah taught about the role of establishing the principle of the equality of women and men, that made a lot of sense to me in terms of how that would tie in directly to domestic violence and ending domestic violence. Perhaps maybe from day one, I was searching. And so maybe my interest in some of these social issues in the world and social injustice was my soul searching for answers for the truth. So when I then collided and met with someone who was actually learning about the Baha'i faith, I just became more primed for it in terms of receiving some of that information and that knowledge. But I was really attracted to the equality of women and men. It made so much sense. Abdul Baha, who's Baha'u'llah's son, he said that humanity is like a bird and men represent one wing and women represent the other. And should one wing remain undeveloped and weak, the bird can't fly. And it made so much sense to me. But there were just so many other teachings in the Baha'i faith that made a lot of sense to me. It was very logical, it was very practical in many ways, and there were many mystical aspects of it that I found really beautiful. I loved that there was no fear in me asking questions, and that it was encouraged for me to really search for truth on my own, and I can read for myself and learn.